In a world gripped by wars in Ukraine and Gaza, nuclear threats going back and forth between Russia and the United States, AI headlines, economic uncertainty, climate disasters, so many of us now are struggling. How is it even possible to be happy and grounded and have peace of mind with everything going on around us? I'm Dr. John Izzo, and today's podcast, we're going to be talking about the 5 mindsets that are destroying our happiness individually and collectively, and show you how you can tame those mindsets and harness them for happiness starting right now. Hi, I'm Dr. John Izzo, and welcome to this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast, where we explore issues and ideas about the future of humanity and planet. We welcome you. Today, we're going to talk about something very important, I think, to every one of us, individually and collectively. And that is, how do we stay grounded, optimistic, hopeful, maybe even happy with everything that's going on in the world right now? If you're listening or watching this podcast, there's a pretty good chance you're a person who has a bit of anxiety about the way things are and the way forward. It's probably why you listen to us and why you watch us. And again, we hear from listeners and friends and colleagues about just how much anxiety and tension so many of us are carrying today. So this question of how do we stay grounded, hopeful, optimistic, maybe even happy with all this going on is critical. But there's another thing we're going to talk about today, which is what are the mindsets that really keep us from a positive, constructive way forward? You know, we spend a lot of time talking about the external world, what needs to change in politics or our political life or in technology, around climate or science. But today we want to focus on the inner life, the inner mindsets that we need to stay resilient and happy right now, and the mindsets we need collectively to shift if we're going to have a great way forward. Now, today's podcast is going to be a little different because I'm usually the co-host, but today I'm going to be the guest because my colleagues Alain, Gauthier, and Jim Burke are going to be leading a conversation with me about my book, The Five Thieves of Happiness, in which I ask that question. And by the end of our podcast today, we're going to have some really practical ways that you can shift your mindset towards happiness in this time of tension, and how we can shift our collective thinking in a way that's going to make it easier to go forward. So let me welcome my 2 colleagues into the podcast studio, and let's get started.
So thank you, John. What are the 5 Thieves of Happiness? And is there some common themes or common thread?
So Alain, I think we have to start with why I even came up with this idea of the Thieves of Happiness. I took a year off from my work in 2015 and took a sabbatical and walked the Camino de Santiago for the first time in northern Spain. I've walked it again a couple of years ago. And then I wound up spending several months in Peru and had all these intentions of all these things I was going to do in Peru, go to the Amazon and hike up to Machu Picchu, et cetera. And I wound up getting marooned, and I think that's the right word, in a little town called Urubamba in the Sacred Valley in central Peru, about 10,000 feet, in altitude. And marooned is the right word because I just didn't want to leave. I didn't want to leave this little village because I felt I was onto something. And I was sitting on a curb, literally in that little town, and asking myself this question: why is it so hard for all of us to sustain happiness? Why is it so hard when we think when we were children, it was so easy to access joy? And then I was looking at just the scene around me and thinking, and why is it so hard for us as humans? Why are we always fighting and destroying the environment when surely in our natural state, we weren't this way? We were kind of like children. We got along, we hunting and gathered and we're actually pretty egalitarian. And it was in that moment that I came up with this idea that maybe there are mindsets that get in the way of both our personal and collective happiness. And literally, Alain, sitting on a curb in this little town in Peru, I named them. They just came to me. These 5 thieves: control, conceit, consumption, comfort, and coveting. And it was almost like a spiritual revelation because I had no idea where they came from. And then I spent the next week in my sabbatical thinking about it. And when I came home, I wrote the book in about 6 weeks, which I'd never done before.
And why do you think these thieves are both personally and societally important?
Well, if you think about it for a moment, why wouldn't the collective outcomes, the societal outcomes, be really an amalgamation of the individual outcomes? If you think about it, almost intuitively, it couldn't be any other way. So the very mindsets that we carry around with us individually that keep us from well-being, that keep us from happiness, that keep us from a sense of magnanimity, if you will, that why wouldn't they be the very things that undermined our collective happiness? And that was the insight that I had, Alain, there in Peru, was that these two things were intimately connected and that the outer life of humanity and society was really an outgrowth of our inner life rather than the other way around. And so if we want to change things, whether it's our own happiness and well-being in this time of tension, or whether we want to change the societal outcomes, we have to work on the very mindsets that are the root cause of what we're producing individually and collectively. So that was kind of the insight for me that, the collective outcomes are really individual outcomes squared.
While talking about the collective, I'm going to invite our producer, Jim Burke, to ask you a first question.
John, I'm really interested about this idea about happiness. You argue happiness is our default setting. Yet we're living through a climate shocks, wars in Ukraine and Gaza, and runaway AI headlines. What really persuades you that contentment or happiness is still innate or even possible? Why does that mindset matter in 2025?
Many of you know I come from a Christian background, though my spirituality has certainly broadened over the decades of my life. I often think of Jesus' comment when he said, unless you become like a child, you will never enter the kingdom of God. And Jesus did not mean by that you'll never have spiritual awakening. I think what he meant was we have this natural happiness and trust and faith. Those of us who are parents know this from our own children, even from when they're young babies. They have this instant smile that can come to them at any moment from the smallest of things. They are born, I think, with a trusting relationship of the world. And I think that trust is taken away from us in traumatic experiences when we're young. But I believe we're born in that trusting, happy place where the smile comes naturally to us. And I can't help but think that the same thing is true of us as humans. And so many of the spiritual traditions talk about not this idea of original sin, but original Garden of Eden, that we had everything we needed, that we were in harmony. And again, you look at many other spiritual traditions, we began in harmony, and that disharmony is not the natural state. And I feel very strongly that we see this even in our own neighborhoods, but that most of us have pretty good relationships with our neighbors, right? We get along, we help each other. And I think that this is the natural state of humanity. And maybe I'm an optimist here, but I do believe that is our natural way. Happiness, like a child. And also we have this capacity to be loving and to be in community with each other. And if you look at early humans, that's kind of how we were. Now we'll get into how we were with other tribes, which is maybe part of the mindset we want to talk about.
Well, John, Donald Trump is often cited as a master of control and conceit. How do those thieves play out in his rhetoric? And what can citizens do internally so we cannot get hijacked by that energy?
Well, as we go through the thieves today, these minds, and think of the thieves as mindsets. And why do I call them thieves? Because thieves rob us of something that belongs to us. So the whole premise of the book is happiness and well-being belong to us. It's our natural state. We have a right to it. And these thieves, these mindsets rob us of it. So this is a good example of how control and conceit rob us of this natural well-being. And let's start with conceit. Conceit literally means the overfocus on the self, the focus on the self as the center of the universe. And you see right now in the rhetoric of Donald Trump a conceit about America, the idea that America must be first. In fact, a lot of people say America only. The belief that a focus on America only and the happiness of America only will, in fact, lead to America being happier, when in fact, the opposite is true. America can only thrive in a world that thrives. America is as dependent on the rest of the world as the rest of the world is on America. So, this focus on the self, which is very natural in a way for human beings, but really robs us of our happiness, is very tempting. And he uses that as a kind of device. If we can focus on our own happiness, focus on our own country, focus on our own people, we will find happiness, ignoring the fact that America cannot be happy in a world that's dysfunctional and not working. And control is really about trying to be in charge, to control our beliefs, to have no dissonance come in. And in many ways, that's the very thing that he's trying to do, controlling dissent, control what universities are teaching, control what books we can read. When in fact, we live in a time when we need an openness and curiosity to many ideas, but he is arguing for a narrowing. And the narrowing comes from a desire to control any dissonance, anything that would get in the way of a core belief that we hold on to so dear. And so a lot of dysfunctional leaders use control and conceit as a way to galvanize people behind them. And I think he uses that very effectively, I think to the detriment of society, but he uses those very effectively. America must focus on itself, conceit. If we focus on our own happiness, we will find happiness. But we must control any thinking or way of being that's different than my belief, when in fact we need curiosity. So there's a tension there that we find both in our personal lives and used here in our collective lives.
But I'm curious how we personally navigate through this as we live in this environment where all these things are changing. How do we use your book to help us as a tool to navigate through this?
Well, we have to begin personally. If in fact the collective is an outgrowth and amalgamation, a result of our inner life, then we have to begin in the inner life. So let's use control as an example. And we can get into, and should really, the way that control gets in the way of our desire for happiness. Because when we wrote the book, we had thousands of people take a quiz that you can still take online about which is your greatest thief. And control, about 50% of people say control is like their number one thief that robs them of happiness, the desire for things to be different than what they are and to be able to control the outcomes. And so I think we have to begin with curiosity ourselves. So we need to be curious why Donald Trump is so alluring. We need to be curious about what's happening in people's lives that this way of thinking has become attractive. We need to be curious about people who see things differently than we do, even if some people are trying to have us crush all differences and all dissent. So we can't respond with the same energy that Donald Trump or those who want to take us in a different direction are putting out there, if you will. So it has to begin in here. We can't counter it with that same energy. That's a fool's game. We have to come from a different place than that place.
As you describe this, John, it's really the mindset we approach this is critical for us to move forward and to be able to create the synergy in ourselves, to have some way to still connect with our happiness and move forward in the environment. I'm going to bring Alain back in for the next question.
Well, I'd like to stay with control for a moment, but looking at it from a different perspective. Many activists feel they must control outcomes to avert catastrophes. How can we stay motivated for hard change? while practicing the surrender that frees us from the thief of control.
Yeah, it's so important, Alain, and it begins again personally. I have a little plaque on my wall here in my office that my publicist gave me when the book came out. And she plucked out a particular quote from the book, which was the best quote in my mind, and it sits there on my wall. And it says, almost all internal suffering is resistance to what is happening in this moment. So I like to use this simple example. You're on your way home from work and you're really eager to get home for something, maybe go gardening or watch a game or whatever it is, spend time with people you love, and you're suddenly in a traffic jam when you didn't expect to be. And you now believe that the source of your unhappiness was the traffic jam, when in fact, the source of your unhappiness is your resistance to the fact that you're in a traffic jam. In other words, you can't change this thing, but your unhappiness actually comes from your desire for it to be different. And of course, in Buddhism, they talk about that in many ways, our unhappiness comes from our desire. But it seems to me that it's a misreading of Buddhism, that what Buddhism actually teaches is something that I boil down to attention without attachment and intention without tension. So let me play this out in our lives right now. I may have this attention to what's happening in the world, whether it's the climate crisis, or maybe I feel a deterioration of democratic institutions, or why are these wars still going on? And I have this intention and desire to do something about it, to have impact. But the moment I get attached to the outcome, the moment that I feel tension around what if I'm not successful, I'm going to be inherently unhappy. So all of us must recognize that we can't control what's going to happen tomorrow or in the years ahead, in our personal lives and in our collective lives. All we can do is in this moment have both attention and intention to act in a way that we believe will create a positive outcome for myself or for others. And it can be very freeing to free yourself from the belief that you can control it, because the tension really comes from the belief that we can control it, that we can somehow, if I just try hard enough, if I just work hard enough, if I just send enough letters. So can you have attention without attachment, intention without tension? And it's actually a beautiful dance that you have to first work on in your personal life, maybe with your spouse. This desire for them to be a certain way tonight, but I can't control it. So can I have intention without tension, tension without attachment? And then you can begin to practice it in the collective life. And it's a fine line. I found that when I first started studying Buddhism, this fine line between resignation and surrender. Resignation is saying, oh, there's nothing I can do, so I'm just going to let things happen. Surrendering is doing everything that I can, but not taking on the tension. What's going to happen is probably what's going to happen. And, Leo Buscaglia, the great Italian-American writer, had a great line about worry that I think a lot of us who worry a lot about the future should remember. He said, worry never robs tomorrow of its sorrow. It only robs today of its joy. So, for example, if I'm worried about human beings may go extinct or close to extinct, or the civilization will collapse, when that time comes, I will have to deal with the emotion of that. But allowing myself and forcing myself to deal with that emotion of it now is actually just bringing double sorrow on myself. I not only have to deal with it when it happens, I'm having to deal with it now. So rather than worry, rather than taking it on, instead, act in this moment with intention, be attentive to everything you can do, but don't take on all the apocalyptic things that may happen in the future. When they happen, we'll have to deal with them. Instead, be in this moment with attention, without tension. Now, I make this sound like it's really easy, but I'll tell you this, if you can't do it in the traffic jam, you won't be able to do it with climate change or wars going on all around you. So you've got to begin there. If you can't do it because When your spouse isn't exactly how you'd like them to be tonight, you're not going to be able to do it with climate change and war. Does that make sense? You got to begin there, because that's what will allow you to deal with it. And make no mistake, I'm not saying don't do anything. I'm saying just recognize it is to some extent out of our control. All we can control are the inputs, the loving inputs. The outputs are ultimately out of our control and out of our purview too, meaning we don't know what's going to happen. So why should we take on all the apocalypse now when we don't even know what's going to happen? Stay in the moment, be attentive, be intentional.
Thank you for these great practical examples, John. Maybe we could shift to coveting and look at it from the social media, because social media seems to be engineered to provoke comparisons with others. What have you learned about taming coveting in the age of endless scrolling? And how can we help younger generations to do the same?
You know, Alain, this is so timely for me for a couple of reasons. One is I just got back from a 32-day trip in Europe. And Janice and I were both talking about how many young people we saw spending literally, some cases, an hour with their friends trying to get the exact right photo to post on social media. And we all know that the reason that we're looking for that one perfect photo is that our happiness comes from having a better photo in a better place than someone else might have. The other thing is when I was at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and I know, Alain, you're from France, and they have all this incredible collection of impressionist art from Monet and Cézanne and Van Gogh. And I happened to be looking at Starry, Starry Night, one of the most beautiful paintings ever made by this tortured, beautiful, sensitive human being, Vincent van Gogh, who ultimately had to take his life. And I'm there just absorbing the enormity and the beauty of this painting and the inner life of the artist. And person by person, people were filing by, spending about maybe 5 or 6 seconds at the painting to get a selfie of themselves or someone they loved with the painting. So in other words, they were not at all absorbing the beauty of this artist or this moment. It was all about saying, look, I was here. Now, the truth is, coveting is a powerful driver of unhappiness for all of us. It's interesting. I chose the word coveting deliberately. It's really an old-fashioned word because I was thinking to myself, I was thinking about the 10 commandments from the Jewish scriptures. And 9 of the 10 commandments are about outer acts. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not use God's name in vain. And then there's only one that is an inner thing, thou shalt not covet. And I thought, isn't that interesting? It's like a commandment, thou shalt not covet. Covet thy neighbor's house, thy neighbor's wife, etc. And I was thinking in the way in which, for so many of us, our happiness is in reference to how we compare with others. And I think of an author friend of mine who wrote a bunch of books and then finally got on the New York Times bestseller list. And she thought, now I have made it. And she called up one of her best friends and said, Lisa, I'm on the New York Times bestseller list. And her friend immediately said, Sue, that's great, but what number are you? And she realized in that moment it would never be enough. It would always be like, well, now I'm on the list, but what number am I? Now, how does social media play into this? Well, it's a perfect petri dish for us to see our happiness compared to others. How many likes did I get versus you? How many friends do I have than you? How many comments did I have than you? And I share research in the book that it turns out that people who are on social media primarily as observers, meaning observing the lives of others, and then comparing their own lives with this, are significantly less happy than those who aren't on social media at all. But here's where it gets interesting, Alain. That same research showed that people who are on social media liking other people's posts, commenting on other people's posts, celebrating the success of other people, and also connecting with other people around issues and things that they care about, are actually happier than those who aren't on social media. So think about it. It's really a great piece of research, because when we are focused on celebrating others, being happy for others' success, when we're on there trying to engage with others to make things better, we're happier. When we're focused on how we compare, how we stack up, we're less happy. And it's true in social media, but it's also true in the real world. And that's why coveting is such a powerful driver of unhappiness. And I bet if a person thinks to themselves, how much of my unhappiness is driven by how I compare myself to others, my looks, my marriage, how my kids are doing, how much money I have, how many books I sold, how many likes I have, we see how insidious this really is. And it has societal implications, because then we start to see other societies in the same way. We start to think, well, if I be a winner, if my society just has more than another society has. So it becomes then a very mindset that drives even our community behavior, our collective behavior, instead of thinking, can everyone win? And I do have a great personal story about how this happened for me, but I can share it if you want, because I like to think I'm too sophisticated to get caught up in that. But I had a great example of how I got caught up in it.
Why don't you go ahead and share that example, John? Then I'm going to ask you about comfort.
It's kind of a fun story, actually, because again, I think I'm above all this stuff, like most of us who teach this stuff, but of course we're not. Before I was in Peru and walked the Camino, I was in Morocco and spent a bunch of time in Morocco, and we went and camped out in the Sahara for a number of days. And so my friend Sarah was going to Morocco about a year and a half later. And I recommended she take this particular experience that we had taken in the Sahara, and she did. And then she posted about it. And I noticed that she had so many more likes and comments on her experience there than I did. And suddenly this thief showed up. I was unhappy. And I was unhappy only because she got more likes and because she got more comments, but she had the audacity, and here I'm being facetious, not to mention that I had recommended this to her. And then suddenly I thought, my God, John, why are you unhappy? You told a friend about a great experience. She had a great experience. Other people are celebrating her great experience and happy seeing and thinking about the experience themselves. Why are you unhappy? Because she got more likes and more comments than you did. And it's a good example of how we have to catch ourselves. And as you know, in the book, I talk about this simple formula about notice, stop, and choose, right? And so I noticed the thief and I stopped it. I said, isn't this silly? And I replaced it with a different mindset. Celebrate her happiness. Celebrate that you, without any credit given, helped her had a great experience, and by default helped others have a great experience. So I'm embarrassed that my wife said, please don't put that in the book. It's embarrassing that you had that idea. And I said, well, I have to put it in the book because people have to see how it happens to all of us.
Well, thanks for talking about your experience with coveting. So let's look at comfort for a moment. Crises demand innovation, yet comfort keeps us clinging to familiar. John, can you tell us why comfort's a thief? And then give us one small example of what listeners can try to build their change muscle.
Thanks, Jim. And when I made comfort a thief, I had this thought of people reading the book going, I get it, control, that's kind of a thief of happiness. Coveting, yeah, that's a thief of happiness. Consumption, thinking happiness is outside of yourself. But then, John, now comfort, being comfortable is a thief of happiness. But it is, and here's why. And it's at two levels. The first is that comfort is a thief of happiness because, as you said, Jim, whether it's in our society or individually, we often get wed to patterns that may have served us at one point in our life, but no longer serve us. And if we get stuck in those comfortable patterns, we can't improve our personal or collective happiness. And I'll give you two quick examples. Someone may grow up in a home whenever people disagreed and had arguments that led to bad things. Maybe it even led to physical abuse. Then they become an adult and maybe they're no longer in an abusive relationship. They're no longer surrounded by abusive people. But every time there's a disagreement of any kind, they shut down that disagreement. They either go along or refuse to find their voice or tell other people, no, let's not disagree, because they think something bad is going to happen. But that belief is no longer serving them because real issues aren't talked through. Real disagreements aren't resolved because of that old belief that they are comfortable in that no longer serves them. And the same thing is true, Jim and Alain, for society. So, for example, once upon a time, nature was very large and big and humans were very small. There's a period of time where, except in a small geography, human beings couldn't impact the entire biosphere of the earth. So we got used to the idea that if we plundered the earth and used the earth, it would lead to more human comfort. And it did for a short period of time. But that belief that served us as one time doesn't serve us when there's 7 billion people and we have technology that allows us to do all the things that we can do with energy, et cetera. Now that very belief that is comfortable to us isn't serving us. Another example, at one time we were in small tribes. What my tribe did wouldn't impact a tribe 1,000 miles or 2,000, let alone 5,000 miles away. So being tribal served humans for many years. But now that we have all these things in common, whether it's nuclear weapons or a climate or the world economy, what my tribe does impacts every other tribe in the world. So tribalism served human beings at one time, but that belief now must be challenged because staying in that comfortable belief will rob us of the collective happiness that we must achieve in a world where we're connected. So in our personal lives, it's thinking about, for example, those patterns in our lives. Like I'll give you one for myself that may help. When I was in high school, I had really bad acne. And I became quite shy and really got bullied a bit because of that. And I learned to play it safe. I learned not to take too many risks, especially if it involved putting myself out there. Now, when I got to university, the acne went away and I kind of got cute. And yet I carried that same belief about myself. Play it safe. Don't take a risk. You might get made fun of. You might not turn out good for you. And it took me years to challenge that belief about myself that was holding me back. So the first is identify patterns in your life that may have served you at one time that no longer serve you now. Then extrapolate that to your business, to your community, to the world. What are some patterns that may be comfortable that may not serve us anymore? And you talked about curiosity earlier, and that's what's required is almost all the time when we have dysfunction, not almost all the time, much of the time, it's because we have a pattern that once served us that no longer serves us. And I think if you go through almost all the problems of humanity, it's things that probably actually worked for us at one time that no longer work in the world that we're in now, because we don't create patterns that don't work. Does that make sense? That child did not learn not to disagree because it didn't work. They did that because it worked. I didn't learn to play it safe because it didn't work. It did work at one time. Humans didn't learn to plunder nature or to be tribal because it didn't work. We did it because it worked at one time. Now it doesn't. But if we don't challenge those comfortable patterns, we wind up living in a world that no longer exists and makes us unhappy and ruins the well-being for all of us.
Thank you, John, for these examples. Let's look at one part of our audience, which is probably sizable. Many of our audience are in the third part of their life. And we wonder, how can elders leverage surrender or gratitude in a way that energizes rather than sidelines them? And how might they model these mindsets without slipping into resignation or complacency?
It's a really interesting question, Alain. And what occurs to me when you ask that is, how do the thieves show up differently in our older years? And a couple of quick examples came to mind for me. Let's talk about coveting. We start comparing ourselves with our younger self. I think of all the older people I meet who talk about all the things they can't do anymore. They talk about the loss of things. But what about the things that we have now with age? The wisdom, the time perhaps for reflection, the perspective, the capacity to not be so focused on the future, but to be in the moment. So part of it as we age is to focus on the things that are the gifts of this moment of our lives, rather than comparing ourselves to our younger self or to younger people, etc. Another piece is around control. So as we age, we realize we lose some control of our bodies. We lose some feeling that we perhaps are not as influential as once we were. Maybe once we were in the business world or in the government world, and now we're in the semi-retired world. But what power can we claim? What power can we use? As you know, I was just in Ireland with David White on a walking tour in the west of Ireland. And he has a particular poem that he wrote called Still Possible. And he talked about how he was staying in the home of a count and a countess in Italy. And the count is going through a lot of physical deterioration and mostly had to stay in his room now. And he'd been a very vital person. And at one point, the countess sent the poem Still Possible up to his room. And he sent it back with 3 words, "It's not possible." And David just sent it back, "It is possible." And they just went back and forth. And I think that part of the aging is what is still possible for me, even at this stage, even with the limitations, even with the things that I have lost. What is still possible for me to do? And, you know, someone we had on our podcast earlier, Rick Moody, said something I love. He said, "It's not too late and you're not too old." And I see so many people who start to have a belief about themselves. And a woman named Becca Rubin at San Diego State University studied how people age. And what she discovered was how we see aging influences how we age. So one of the mindsets we have to hold on to as we age is not a mindset that to be old is to be feeble. To be old is to have lost our powers or influence. No, to be older is to claim new powers. To be old is to see what's still possible. And I think this is so important as we age because it's so easy to surrender to a different way of being. And then we're no longer of use to ourselves or others when we allow that to happen.
Well, John, you've really identified how important mindset is with elderly or with anyone. There's another field that you spend a lot of time, and that's the business field. You've done a lot of work in sustainability. Sustainability says do less harm. Regeneration says leave it better. What thief mostly seduces companies into settling for less harm, and how can a CEO flip that script while still pleasing Wall Street?
Well, there's a lot in there. And going back to the thief of comfort, there's no doubt that when it comes to the world of business, comfort is a problem. And I'll give you a simple example of that. We all talk about how communism failed, which was true. If anyone spent any time in the former Soviet Union, as I did, you know that system didn't work. And so we take all this joy that capitalism as we practice it has worked because we compare it with other bankrupt systems like feudalism and communism in the way that it wound up being practiced in places like China and the Soviet Union in the 1950s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. But we have this very religious belief that capitalism as we practice is the best of all possible worlds. So instead of evolving capitalism, instead of evolving business in a different way, we get stuck in this old paradigm. Well, this is the best system. Well, it may be the best system we had until now, but it's obviously not the best system because we're destroying the environment and inequity is growing and we're still fighting wars with each other, economic and otherwise. So obviously, capitalism as we practice it can't be the best of all possible worlds. And I think that when it comes to any business, challenging your assumptions is so important. And I think that many businesses have really gotten hijacked by this belief that unrelenting growth is the only path, that capitalism as we practice it is the most functional system, even though it's producing outcomes that are in many ways not what individuals in the system would desire. And I think we need that curiosity, and we need that willingness to look at the system in a different way. And, many people know I'm a bit disillusioned with the corporate social responsibility, sustainability movement, because I do believe your point, Jim, is well taken. And that is that in many ways, it feels like the desire is just keep replicating what we're doing for as long as we possibly can. And what we need is a different, more regenerative system, a way that could create ongoing, sustainable, and even regenerative outcomes for society, for the environment, and for communities and individuals. And the system we have now isn't doing that. So I'm very disappointed sometimes in the curiosity about how things might be more radically different than they are now. I think we're tinkering around the edges. And here I think the thief of comfort is the biggest thief. And maybe conceit too, in the sense that a belief that my business can succeed if the society isn't successful. Some folks from Coca-Cola, and maybe it's a rhetoric, maybe it's real, said to me a few years ago, we've been around for 100 plus years. We want to be around for another 100 plus years. And we don't think we can be around for 100 plus more years thriving if society doesn't thrive. And I think that that's the conceit of business sometimes, is the belief that business can somehow thrive if society doesn't thrive, if the environment doesn't thrive, if world global relationships don't thrive. And it's a myth. And that's where conceit can deceive us, because, if I can stay successful, even if the whole isn't successful. And of course, we know that's not true.
John, you were talking about mindsets. When I think of capitalism, I think of it as a worldview. It's almost larger than a mindset. Can you contrast worldviews and mindset and how it's important to look at both and deal with both?
I'd go further, Jim. I think capitalism is a religion, because there are people who have as fervent a belief in capitalism as we practice it as they do of some of the historic religions. And religion is a beautiful thing when it drives us to beautiful outcomes for ourselves and for others. We also know that religion can be a very destructive force when it separates us from others or blinds us to new ideas that might even be helpful to us personally, let alone collectively. So I think we have to face the fact that capitalism as we practice it is actually kind of a religion. And the danger of religions is we get wed to them. They don't evolve. They don't grow. They don't morph. And I think that's why capitalism as we practice it is so dangerous, because it's more than a mindset. It's kind of a religion. And whenever you have a religious fervor about something, you hold on to it even when it's not working the way it needs to. And I'm not smart enough to know all the ways capitalism needs to evolve. I can think of a few important ones, but I know it has to evolve. It has to change. Just like a truly beautiful religion will evolve and change, which is heresy to some and music to some.
That's very curious, because one of your previous lives was as a minister. How did you evolve or change?
Well, my spirituality has changed in a lot of ways over the years. In some ways, it has stayed the same. Some of the core values, the core beliefs about the world, the core beliefs about, who we are and why we're here. By being open to other traditions, I believe my spirituality has grown and evolved in a way that is richer and more beautiful even than how it began. And I feel the same thing is true of cultures, of business, of mindsets, that the more we're curious and seek to amalgamate and learn from many things, the more happy and successful that we're going to be. And I think that that's the kind of thinking that we need is really that openness and curiosity of how we can learn and become different and evolve. And that's what's happened with my spiritual life. And in many ways, it's a more beautiful spiritual life than I had in a younger version. And even St. Paul said, when I was a child, I thought and acted like a child. But now that I'm not a child, I act and think differently. And maybe as a human species, we're in that same predicament. We're still thinking like when we were children. And we need to maybe find a new way of thinking that's a more mature adult version of humanity, because we're kind of stuck in our adolescence, as Carl Sagan pointed out when he was alive.
So if you haven't talked about AI, I'd like to ask the AI question.
Go with it.
AI is a hot topic these days. And there is a question as to whether generative AI can fuel actually coveting, for instance, having a perfect lifestyle on demand, yet also personalized mindfulness tools. In your view, does AI net help or net hinder the fight against the thieves?
I'm in really the Zen not knowing mind about AI. And because I use it every day now, and I feel guilty when I use it because I realize how much energy it's using, which is quite frightening. But it's an incredibly useful tool in a whole variety of ways. It could make our life easier. It could take over some routine tasks that we don't want to be doing. It could accelerate the integration of thinking around complex problems like sustainability in a quicker way. On the other hand, it could pull us even further away from the relationship world into having a more virtual relationship with virtual reality, as AI allows us to experience the world without actually experiencing the world. And so I think that we maybe worry too much about the technology and not enough about the mindset of how we use the technology. If in fact I'm right that the mindset is the real issue, then if we bring the same mindset to AI, of course we will produce the same dysfunctional outcomes. So how can we bring genuine curiosity? How can we use AI to celebrate rather than covet? How can we use AI to challenge our assumptions rather than simply reinforce them? And how can we use AI to build bridges with each other rather than separate us? So I'm a bit agnostic on AI. I see its potential, but what it eventually produces will be an outgrowth of the mindset that we bring to it. So if we bring the right mindset, it will probably bring beautiful things. If we bring the wrong mindset, it will bring the same outcomes squared again. So here's a way to think about it. Every human technology will accelerate the mindset that we have at the time we have that technology. And here's a good example. The internet had the potential to bring the world together. But because of our tribal mindset, because of our control and desire to not have cognitive dissonance or to deal with people whose views are different than ours because it's uncomfortable, and I could go on, we use the internet mostly, not exclusively, in ways that divide us rather than bring us together because of that mindset. Whereas if I had a non-coveting mindset, if I had a non-conceit mindset, if I had a non-comfort mindset, I would want the internet to challenge my beliefs. I would want the internet to be a place where I could celebrate and come together with others. See where I'm going with that? So I think we already know what happened with the internet is it did produce some coming together. It did produce some positive innovation, but mostly it produced negative outcomes because of these thief mindsets that mean we used it for the wrong reason. I think there's no reason to think AI won't go the same way as social media and the internet. With the wrong mindset or a less functional mindset, it will produce dysfunctional outcomes. With the right mindset, it could bring beautiful outcomes. So let's work on the mindset, because if the mindset going in, junk, the old junk in, junk out, garbage in, garbage out, garbage mindset, garbage outcomes for AI, garbage mindset, garbage outcomes for social media. Change the mindset, different outcomes.
Well, John, I really agree with you. I've been using a lot of AI, and I see both its potential for good and its potential for evil or bad. And I have a question mark like you do. What's going to happen? Well, as everything happens, we're running toward the end here, and I have two final questions for you. The first one is, give us a play-by-play of the last time you personally felt hijacked by one of the thieves. And how did you use the notice, stop, replace? How does that look in the wild? And how long did it take? And my second question is one of the most difficult questions for any author who wrote any book. If you were writing Five Thieves today, what chapter or new thief would you add? And then I'll say a few words and then we'll have you close.
I was thinking about this. When did this happen for me recently? And I'll go back to something Alain said. It happened to me recently around age. And really recognizing limiting belief, if you will, around, what's still possible at this stage of my life. And one of the things I teach in the book, and this may be a good gift to people around their own happiness, is every time I have a thought, I ask myself, is this mindset a friend or a foe of my happiness? A friend or a foe of my well-being? So I kept having this thought, maybe it's too late. Maybe I don't have the energy anymore to really make the kind of difference that I want to make in the world. And then I did what I teach in the book, which is I noticed and asked the question, is this mindset, is this thought a friend or a foe of my happiness and my well-being? And I immediately knew, okay, this is not a friend. This is a foe of my happiness. So the first thing I have to do then is I have to stop that habitual thought. And that doesn't mean I won't ever have the thought again, but I can't indulge the thought. I can't make a bedroom for the thought. I can't buy a condo for the thought. I've got to say, every time I have it, I have to say, this thought is not a friend of my happiness, and gently brush it aside. But that's not enough, because you can stop a thought, but what do you replace it with? And that's the third step. And so notice it, stop it, and then choose something different. Make a different choice. So I replace it now with the thought, well, some things are not still possible, but some things are still possible. Let me focus on what's still possible. I don't have as much energy as I once had, but I still have a lot of energy. What will I do with that energy? So I think a great way that people can use this is just every time you have a thought, is this a friend or a foe of my happiness? A friend or a foe of me being a better human being? A friend or a foe of me being a more contributory, generous, generative human being, or a less contributory, generative human being? And stop it. Meaning, don't let that thought keep coming into your mind. You're the master of your thoughts, not the other way around. But then you have to replace it with something else, because that's the way the human mind works. You can't really kick a thought out without replacing it with another one that takes its place. We know that about the neuroscience. So anyway, that's one that happened for me, and I consistently have to stop that thought. It's not too late. I still have a lot of energy. What am I going to do with that energy, with the time that I have left? Now, that second question, if I had to rewrite the book, what thief would I add? First, I don't think I could put another one with a C. It was hard enough to find 5 C's, and people make fun of me for using C's, but I thought it'd be more memorable, right? It's easier to remember them in the moment of truth, which is the point, if they all had C's in them. And I can't say that there's a new thief that has showed up since then, because those have turned out to be enough for me to try to tame in my own life. This 5 seems like enough thieves already to tame. But maybe if there was one thing, I think that curiosity would maybe be a positive thing I would have wanted to talk more about in the book. Curious about the beliefs of others, curious about your own patterns, curious about yourself in the deepest way. And maybe I'll end with a story, because I think it relates to the time that we're in. When Donald Trump was running for the first time, I was on an airplane right after the North Carolina primary. And if you remember then, it was really unclear whether he had a real chance of winning or not. He had just won the North Carolina primary, and I was on an airplane in first class flying from Charlotte to Los Angeles. I sat next to a guy, and we got to talking about the primary, and I said, "Did you vote?" He said, "Yes." We had just ordered dinner, and I said, "Who did you vote for, if you don't mind my asking?" And he said, "Donald Trump." And I said, "I am so glad that I'm sitting next to you, I said, because we're going to have dinner together in a few minutes, and I have not actually spoken to someone who's voted for Donald Trump yet. And I am incredibly curious to learn why you voted for him and why you think that's the right way forward. And for the next hour, I simply listened to him tell me why he had voted for Donald Trump. It doesn't matter in the moment, but I tell you some of the things he said, which are interesting. He said, well, first of all, I think the whole thing is screwed up. Washington's screwed up. The government isn't responsive. We need to blow it up. Second, I think it'd be nice to have somebody from business, from a different perspective to come in. But here's the point of the story, not about Donald Trump, but I leaned into my genuine curiosity. And I learned some really important things about how someone who differed from me was thinking about the world. So I think curiosity would have been even more powerfully present if I wrote the book again, especially because of the times we live in now, when we think we have to be so genuinely curious about why other people may see some things, whether it's the environment or climate or capitalism or the border, differently than we do. Because if we're curious, we maybe have a chance of coming together.
Well, John, I'm fascinated by that, because when you talk about being curious, what I think about is seeing the world through somebody else's eyes. And if I can see the world through somebody else's eyes, then they can feel that. They know that. There's a trust development. And you develop trust with that man sitting next to you. I want to say today has been a remarkable time listening to you talking about this book, revisiting after all these years. I want to thank Alain for a wonderful set of questions and for being our partner in this. And for you, John, stepping out of the role of being the host and being the guest was a challenge. And me stepping up to being one of the co-hosts. So I really enjoyed today. Alain, do you want to say any last comments before we end this one today?
Yes, I'd like to build on what John added, curiosity. For me, curiosity also reflects humility. And that's one of the habits of the heart that Tocqueville talked about. How can we stay humble enough? And that probably comes more easily when we are in the third part of our life, knowing that things have worked and some other things haven't worked. So how humble can I be? That's the question that for me goes together with what you said about curiosity. Thank you, John.
I want to thank you, Alain. This has been an exciting journey for the three of us to do this podcast. When we sit down, the three of us, and talk together, it's just incredible experience. And today's been an incredible experience for me. And I feel privileged to have both Alain and John as my partners in this endeavor. So I'm going to ask John to do the closing as he usually does. And I want to ask you to please subscribe to our website. Please give us comments. You're our audience. We need you, and we want you to be a participant. So, John, could you close for us?
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Alain. And it was a great joy to do this, and actually more fun in a way to be a guest than to have to come up with those great questions. But also now I know why our guests get stumped sometimes, because you guys ask some great questions. And what a joy to do this podcast with you. And I want to double down on what you said, Jim. We'd love to hear more from you as our audience. Please subscribe on Apple and Podbean and Spotify and YouTube, wherever you're watching us. Please make some comments there. We love hearing from you, and other listeners love hearing from you. And please check out our website, wayforwardpodcast.com. Join our community. And again, we just love to hear more from you. It just means so much to us. And finally, it was just such a great privilege to get to talk about this book, now almost a decade after I wrote it. It's hard to believe. And I think it's as relevant today as it was then. And if you want to dig deeper, you can still get it on Amazon, The Five Thieves of Happiness. And this is a moment in time where we're going to have to make sure we stay in a centered, grounded, resilient, happy place, because a lot is going to be required of us in these years and decades ahead. And remember, garbage in, garbage out. If we don't work on the mindset, the outcomes will not change. It's as true in our personal lives as it is in our collective lives. So anyway, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on The Way Forward. And again, we'd love to hear from you. Good day.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. You have many choices, and we appreciate your interest and support. We want to hear from you. Please reach out to us at thewayforwardrc@gmail.com with your thoughts and feedback. Your input helps us create a podcast that you want to listen to and share with your friends. If you have guest recommendations, we would love to hear those as well. A special thank you to our sponsors, Elders Climate Action and Elders Action Network, who are building a movement of elders to address the environmental, governance, and social issues of our time. You can learn more about their work at eldersaction.org and eldersclimateaction.org. Until next time, I'm Jim Burke, and this is the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, and Amazon Music. You can watch us on YouTube. In parting, may I wish you a regenerative present and future.